The government is set to announce new guidelines for schools on the issue of gender identity, and in a sign that their priority is genuinely the welfare of children and not just feeding a culture war, it's all been leaked to the Sun. This is the headline. Rishi's school rules schools to be banned from letting pupils change gender if their parents oppose it in new guidance from Rishi Sunak. And in the article, they write this. Under the new plans, heads in England will be told that parents must always be consulted if a child wants to be called another name or wear a different gender uniform, and the school will not be able to use the child's new preferred pronouns until parents give a consent. Teachers will be ordered not to recognise a transition within the school gates if the parents do not agree with it, and neither students nor teachers will have to call another pupil by their preferred pronouns if they do not want to. Even if parents do give the move the green light, heads must also consider the mental effects on other children before approving the gender change, following a long period of consideration. Goes on to say this. The PM will also insist that sport should be protected for children in the name of safety, and to keep it fair, where a child is questioning their gender, they should not be allowed to play competitive sport. Some reaction to the guidance has compared it to Section 28. That's the laws that prevented anything about lesbian, gay and bisexual lifestyles being taught in English schools between 1988 and 2003. But Tabitha McIntosh, who's a school English teacher and researcher, made this point on social media. This is not Section 28, it's worse. Section 28 didn't mandate that parents be informed if a 16-year-old said they were gay. It didn't say that straight students' well-being had to be considered in a school's decision to allow students to be LGB. It didn't outlaw my trousers. Ash, what do you make of this news story, and I suppose that analogy to Section 28?
I think it's a pretty pertinent analogy, because when it comes to students dealing with their sexuality, there absolutely is no pressure on teachers to make disclosures to parents against the pupil's will. And that's exactly how it should be. Because sure, in an ideal world, parents would be informed and aware of whatever kind of life changes their child was going through. But that's not always possible. Now, there are some quite serious reasons why that's not always possible. It might be that a child is being raised in a homophobic or a transphobic family. It might be that they're at risk of abuse, whether that abuse is physical or emotional. But it might also just be that kids need time to work stuff out by themselves. They need privacy. They need guidance from people who aren't just within their immediate family. And that doesn't necessarily mean that their parents are like bad, or, they're being shut out of their child's life. But I just think it's natural. I mean, that's been the case for many of my queer friends and my queer family, which is that before they came out to their parents or their siblings, they just needed that time to be able to work it out outside of a family home context, to have people to talk to explore those aspects of their identity before they were ready to present it to their family.
I don't envy teachers trying to navigate this issue, especially as the conversations they engage in might end up getting shared by right-wing media organisations online. So what you'll hear now is a recording between a teacher and two 13-year-old students. There's clearly been some sort of disagreement in the classroom, and this is what happens next.
How dare you? You've just really upset someone. Saying things like, should be in an asylum.
I didn't say that. I just said if they want to identify as a cat or something, then they're like genuinely unwell.
Then they've gone.
Yeah, they're crazy.
You were questioning their identity.
I wasn't a question. I was just saying about the gender. I didn't say anything about them.
But where did you get this idea from? There's only two genders.
I just think it's my opinion.
That is my opinion.
If I respect their opinion, can't they respect my opinion?
It is not an opinion.
Yes,
Yeah, but
it's not an opinion.
There's only two
Loads
genders.
of people think there's only two genders.
There's only a boy and a girl.
Literally. There's no other private part. There's only two.
Gender is not linked to the parts that you were born with. Gender is about how you identify, which is what I said right from the very beginning of the
I just don't agree with that. So why should I have to listen to something I don't agree with?
Biological sex, there is actually three biological sexes, because you can be born intersex. You can be born with male and female body parts or hormones.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Yeah, there's three. There's not 300.
Doesn't mean.
Yeah, there's three. I'm talking about biological sex. In terms of gender, there are lots of genders. There is transgender, there is a gender, people
Yeah,
that
but there
don't
is
believe
that.
they have a gender at all.
Yeah, but you can't have that. You
Can't have that. It's not a law.
Yeah,
No,
but
it's not a law, but it's our opinion. We just don't agree with it. We just think it's all just.
if you have a vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy.
Yeah.
But cisgender is not necessarily the way to be. You were talking about the fact that cisgender is the norm, that you identify with the gender of the sexual order that you're born with, or you're weird. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah.
Which is really despicable.
How? When it's
If I called my mum right now, my mum would
Same.
be on my side.
If I called my mum, she'd say.
Well, that's very sad as well then.
How is it?
Loads of people agree with that. There's only a small majority of people who actually think that.
And why do you think we have so many problems in the world with homophobia?
Yeah, but
Because
that's
of
not
people
homophobia.
expressing-
That's gender.
Yes,
I'm
it
fine
is.
with lesbians and gay people.
Same.
I've got nothing against them.
Yeah, same.
But gender there is a link between it, and you're saying that people can't
isn't
change
No, they
who they want
can't.
to be.
They can't. Unless you get
You're
a
so
penis
wrong.
attached. No, I'm not.
You're confusing sex and gender.
No, I'm not though. Because if
Yes,
you have a
you are.
vagina, you're a girl. If you have a penis, you're a boy.
Yeah, you can't have a vagina and be a girl, but then
Gender
they
Unless you get
identify
separate,
as
even then,
Gender
because
is
you've got
about
those genes.
how you identity.
I just
How you
don't agree with it.
identify.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
not an opinion
Yes,
that we
it is.
express in this
Yes,
school.
it is.
No, it's not. And if you don't like it, you need to go to a different school. So
I did go to a
I'm
different
reporting you to Miss Willis.
It seemed to be that first another pupil objected to what these other individuals were saying, and then the teacher got involved, and it all exploded into a much bigger discussion about the relationship, if there is any, between sex and gender. So you don't know if this is within the context of a pupil being trans or non-binary, being bullied, being interrogated, and that's something which is then being intervened with in a way which I think then is kind of clumsy, because what you would want a teacher to do is two things at once. One is to preserve the dignity and the safety of all of their pupils, and to protect pupils who may be experiencing bullying because of homophobia or transphobia, to give them the support and the protection that they need, right? That's absolutely a teacher's first priority. And then the second thing is going, okay, well, how do I teach my pupils to have a discussion in a way which is respectful and isn't closing down quote unquote reasonable opinion, but is facilitating their ability to have a discussion in a way which is productive and fruitful. Now, I think in saying it is not an opinion, that's not a way in which that's happening. What you would want to do is to say, okay, well, this is what science has to say about the biology of sex, and here are all the different ways in which you can look at gender. But what isn't up for negotiation is within the space of this classroom or the school environment, the validity of a trans or non-binary student's identity. Like, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about it. But to go back to the point I was making before my, I guess quite clearly transphobic internet decided to crap out on me, I don't envy teachers being dragged into the middle of a culture war, just as you said. But I do think that they've got a duty and a real responsibility in terms of, looking out for the safety of trans, non-binary and questioning pupils. And that does mean thinking about the ways in which, quote unquote debate, in reality, a kind of targeted interrogation can be a form of bullying. Isn't always, but definitely can be. And I also think that they've got a duty to look out for the way in which a certain degree of privacy and autonomy is needed by kids in order to grow up into well-adjusted adults. And I think we recognize that when it comes to sexuality. We recognize it not as an absolute right, but as a qualified right when it comes to sexual activity. There is such a thing as Gillick competency. There is such a thing as, respecting the medical autonomy of under 16s in accessing reproductive health care. And I think that those are important principles to bear in mind. Obviously, you would want parents to feel like they knew what was going on in their children's lives, but that isn't a wholly unqualified right either.
There's the question of sex and gender and what is their relationship to each other. There's also just how would you deal with that in a classroom situation. I'm imagining if I was sort of teaching about gay marriage or something in a lesson, when I've been in these lessons talking about issues such as this, if someone says I'm a fundamentalist Christian or very strongly religious and I think it's a sin, you'd say, okay, that's your opinion, but in this space, we need to recognize, that this is valid. You can keep that to yourself if you want, because some people will find that offensive, so it's not to say it's despicable that you have that view. It's to say you expressing that view in too assertive a way is, as you can imagine, I think going to upset some people. So can we please calm down a little bit? More difficult said than done. Being a teacher is very, very hard, as I always say on this show. As I've also said throughout this segment, there might be complicated issues here. One thing that is not particularly complicated is that Rishi Sunak is not an honest broker on this question. That was made clear in this new video obtained by Pink News.
At the same period of time over the period, you may have noticed Ed Davey has been very busy. Like me, you would have probably seen that he was busy trying to convince everybody that women clearly had penises. And I was reflecting, you will all know, I am a big fan of everybody studying maths to 18. But it turns out that we need to focus on biology to 18.
So gross and so puerile. That was him talking to the 1922 committee. I don't even want to really have a conversation on this basis, but in case anyone is watching that thinking Sunak is right, essentially what he is arguing is that no one can be a trans woman unless they've had bottom surgery, which is really extreme to sort of say you will not be treated as a woman unless you go through a very invasive surgery, which is, not my understanding of trans issues, not like the medical establishment's understanding of trans issues, and is actually an incredibly oppressive position to have to anyone who is trans.